Okay, so now we're going to go to the home front. What was going on in America as World War I began? First off, we didn't have a standing army, so in order to collect a large fighting force, Congress had to pass a Selective Service Act, and that meant that men between the age of 21 and 31 must register for the military. There was probably about 24 million men in total for that age. 3 million men were called, and by 1918, 4.8 million men were in the services. Of course, wars always cost money. So, what had to happen? First, there's an increase in taxes, because that's who pays for wars. And second, the government started a campaign in which they sold Liberty and Victory loans. These were bonds, actually, government bonds. And how they worked is you could buy a bond at a bank, say a $25 bond, but it had a face value when it matured of $50. But so you would pay $25, and in 14 years it was worth $50. If you kept the bond past that, it earned more and more money. So it was kind of like a way for the American public to loan the government money. And in turn, you would make money because you would get the interest on what you loaned to the government. The government also had to take control of some things to make sure that the country was running well for a war. So the government takes over the railroad, the telegraph, telephones. The War Industries Board is set up, and that industry decides what goods and products are going to be produced. So if you had a factory that was manufacturing, say, washing machines, they might come in and say, well, no, we don't need washing machines anymore. Now we need ammunition. And your factory was taken over, and the government controls, and you would be producing ammunition. The other Council of Defense was set up, and under it was the Food Administration, because now we're supplying millions of men overseas with food. And we're also helping our allies by sending food for them as well. So Americans were being urged to plant victory gardens. And to your right, you see a propaganda poster saying, sow the seeds of victory. Plant and raise your own vegetables. So this is how you're going to win the war. You're going to plant seeds, and that was going to be victory. Another effect that the war has on America is in the workforce, and on very specific people in the workforce. If you notice, this is another propaganda poster. For every fighter, a woman worker. So we're trying now, women typically stayed at home. We're trying to urge the women, get out of the house and go to the factory. Farmers, of course, were affected greatly because commercial farmers now had to increase production, but not for consumption at home, but consumption by the soldiers abroad. African Americans were affected because there were a lot of types of jobs that were closed to them that now became open to them. And again, as I said, women were the most greatly affected because a lot of women left the home and went into the job force. Another effect of the war on Americans is that our civil liberties were actually taken away from us under the Espionage Act of 1917, which was a new law that allowed the government to censor publications sent through the mail. Remember, to censor something means that they have the right to look at it and decide whether or not it should be sent in the mail, or if they should cross out parts of it, or allow the public to see it. It also made it a crime to aid enemy nations or interfere with the draft. So if you didn't believe in the draft and you were trying to protest the draft, that was now going to be a crime. Also, the Sedition Act of 1918 was passed. This The Sedation Act meant the jailing and internment of those who criticized the government actions or positions. And that was kind of scary for most Americans because here in America, we're used to being able to say, hey, we think the government is wrong, they're not doing the right thing, they got to change their mind. And now you had to be really careful because depending on who you were talking to and what you were talking about and how serious you were, you could actually be jailed for voicing your opinion. So get out your charts. The effects of World War I on the home front. We obviously have social, economic, and political effects. So economically, total government control of production. We get full employment, and there is rationing of certain products because certain things had to be sent to the soldiers. So that meant there were less for the average American. Social impact, and as I said, mostly this impact was on women. Women worked in the factories. They supplied the troops. They also, many women were nurses and actually went overseas to take care of our troops overseas. But when the men came home, women were expected to leave the workforce. And then some political effects. We have censorship, which, from after the American Revolution, people were not used to censorship. And there's propaganda. So we've got propaganda to try and get people to think in a certain way. And this was all intended to prevent anti-war sentiments. Of course, we all know the outcome of World War I is an Allied victory, but there was a very large cost in casualties. The British, French, and Russian lose about 4 million men, women as well. And the United States, of course, because we entered the war when it was almost over, we only suffer about a little over 50,000 casualties. So as the war was coming to an end, on January 18th, 1918, Wilson, in a speech to Congress, brought forth his 14 points. And this was a program for a world without imperialism or secret treaties, where self-determination and democracy would flourish, and where the voices of weak nations would be heard as loudly as those of the strong. In Wilson's imagined future, the League of Nations, a global covenant among nations, would peaceably settle future conflicts. And if you remember when we talked about the type of diplomacy Wilson used, and it was moral diplomacy, and you can see in his 14 points a very strong resonate of that moral diplomacy. Then, in October 5th, 1918, Germans sent a note of peace to Wilson. And on November 11th, on 1918, Germany signs an armistice, and World War I comes to an end. But it was very important in Wilson's mind if the sacrifices of blood that Americans had to pay in World War I were ever going to be justified, it had to be with an outcome that didn't simply end the fighting, but created a new international order. And he really felt that this League of Nations was going to be the answer to that. So here's Wilson's 14 points. Reduction of arms, independent Poland, independent Czechoslovakia, the restoration of Belgium. If you remember, Germany just kind of marched into Belgium just for the heck of it, even though they had a 70-year peace treaty. Wilson also wanted free trade, which meant the freedom to trade with whomever you wanted, freedom of the seas, self-determination for those colonies that were carved up during the age of imperialism, and of course the one thing that he thought would end all future wars, the League of Nations. But many Americans didn't agree with him on the League of Nations. Americans thought that the League of Nations would tie us to foreign affairs, with other nations. And really, by the end of World War I, most Americans were looking to become isolationists once again and just have nothing to do with foreign affairs. So, when we go to the Treaty of Paris to sign our peace treaty, who's in attendance? Well, the big four: France, Britain, Italy, and of course the United States. Many other of the allies are not in attendance. And there they are. So, a little question for you here. Beyond peace, Wilson sought what at the end of the war? What was the name of his proposal or his package? And what about this idea made it problematic for the U.S.? So finally we go into and sign the Treaty of Versailles. These are the key components to the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, Wilson's 14 points. Colonies become mandates. They do accept the League of Nations as part of the treaty. End of the Ottoman Empire. And new nations are created out of the colonies that had been taken over during imperialism. And lastly, Germany is punished for its role in World War I. Germany has to accept responsibility for starting the war. I don't know, I thought it was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but they have to abolish the mandatory military service and cut their army down to 100,000 men. They must demilitarize the French and German border, which means they could have no military on that border that where the French and German countries meet. No longer could they have colonial expansion, and they had to pay $33 billion in reparations to other countries. And the German leaders were forced to sign this document. Some of the new countries that are formed in Europe: Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Romania. Remember, we were looking for Romania on the map. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So, Wilson comes back with the Treaty of Versailles, and it has to go to Congress and be approved in Congress. And there are some problems with that. As I said before, not only the American people, but Congress was opposed to the League of Nations. Public opinion had turned against involvement in foreign affairs, and they believed the League of Nations was just going to drag us in to any conflicts that happened in Europe or Asia. So ratification fails in Congress, and the U.S. never does become a permanent part of the League of Nations. So what were the effects of the Treaty of Versailles? It's rejected by the U.S. Senate, which means a decline in the power of the League of Nations. Without the United States, one of the most powerful countries at that time, the League is going to lose a little bit of its credibility and a lot of its power. 2, Germans become extremely bitter because of the punishments that they have to suffer. And this will give rise to Hitler. And lastly, Asia and Africa are angry at the broken promises by the Europeans. So now we're going to have an increase in independent movements. So, last question. What effect did the Treaty of Versailles have on Germany? And what do you think this will lead to? Well, this is a little bit shorter than the last one. See you next time.